Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the With Chinese Characteristics podcast. I'm Natalie.
And I'm Cherry.
Together we talk about topics with Chinese characteristics, hence the name. This week is part 2 of our Top Peasant Rebellion series, where we're going to talk about 4 more peasant rebellions. Cherry and I were actually talking earlier. If you're not familiar, if you didn't listen to the first one, China has a long history. It has a lot of dynasties. Its most famous landmark is the Great Wall. And that might lead you to assume that most threats from China come from without, when in reality, most dynasties' biggest threat they ever face is internally. And it's either coups, dynastic struggles, or very commonly peasant rebellions. If the people feel like the emperor is doing a bad job, or even if they're just unhappy, right? They might not even really know who the emperor is. But if they're starving, they're hungry, they don't feel like they're being protected, they form bandits, They form armies, they rally behind figureheads and start heading towards wherever the capital is.
Overturn the dynasty and start a new one.
Right? Exactly. Okay, so what are our 4 more peasant rebellions?
Well, so the first one that we're bringing to you today is Daizexiang Uprising. And Daizexiang is a place in China.
What part of China is that in?
Right in the middle.
Okay, interesting.
Roughly.
The heartland?
Inland.
Sure.
I'm non-committal to the exact location.
Yeah.
It is in the Anhui province.
Okay.
So it was the first recorded peasant rebellion at a scale in Chinese history. It happened in 209 BCE and it lasted only 3 months.
Okay.
But we are talking about it because in a way it is very significant and it is the first recorded peasant rebellion in Chinese history.
So before or after the first recorded dynasty?
It almost ended the first recorded
So
dynasty.
the guy who built the Great Wall.
Following the death of Qin Shi Huang, the guy who built the wall.
Okay.
Who started the wall.
And this is confusing for me, but there's 2 dynasties that sound like Qing dynasty in China. Say them right next to each other. Say the 2.
Qin.
Okay, so
Very different.
So Qing is the
Manchurians.
It's the colonialism one. It
The
fought the opium.
colonialism one.
It was on the receiving end of the colonialism. And then the Qing is the first dynasty.
Good job.
So first dynasty, first peasant rebellion.
Yeah. The uprising started and was named by the location in Daizexiang, which translates to Big Swamp Village.
Mm-hmm.
Not a very significant city.
I'm
any
sure
means.
there's probably lots of cities called that.
Big swamp cities.
Yeah, right?
Big lake cities, small lake cities.
Yeah.
So Chen Sheng and Wu Guang are the 2 leaders of the movement, of the rebellion. They were part of this group of 900 commoner soldiers who were sent north to a city called Yuyang as part of the government official posting for the military.
Okay, because one of the things that Qin Shi Huang, one of the things that he was famous for, right? We talked about in the Great Wall episode, mass mobilizations, lots of construction, lots of moving troops around everywhere.
Lots of enlisting.
These people were told to go move to this new area.
Yes. And the government official in charge picked these 2 to be managing the other commoners. They're like the leaders now.
Okay.
However, their trip was delayed due to extreme weather, rainstorm, and flooding.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you can see the cars are stacking right
Yeah.
now. So their trip was delayed. The harsh Qing laws at the time was that anyone late to show up for government/military posting would be executed, regardless of the nature of the delay.
Okay.
No excuses. Chen Sheng and Wu Guang realized that they could never make it on time, and they decided to rebel against the government instead. Can you blame them?
The Chinese imperial punishments for things are so comically harsh.
Yeah.
Like, it's like, oh, somebody,
Didn't want their head shaved.
Yes, or didn't bow right to some governor, and then the entire village gets executed.
Yeah.
So it's like, you know what I mean? You might as well rebel. Like, they can't do anything worse to you.
Mm-hmm. After they made the decision to do this, they didn't start right away, however. They strategized. What they did was that they wrote the words Chen Sheng as king on a piece of cloth and stuffed it in a fish, which would later be cooked by another fellow peasant soldier who, quote-unquote, discovered the cloth and thought it was a sign from heaven.
Wait. You can't just declare yourself emperor, because it doesn't work like that,
You
right?
need a sign.
Yeah, you need a sign that says you're emperor.
Yeah.
Okay.
So they're going to manufacture the sign. And And then, late at night, they started a bonfire at an abandoned temple nearby. They hid in the darkness and shouted with a high-pitched voice. They were trying to mimic the voice of a fox, apparently.
Foxes don't speak.
Well, if they did, they were speaking a high-pitched voice, they thought.
Okay.
Glory to the great kingdom of Chu. Chen Sheng will be king. Chu, the kingdom, was one of the kingdoms that was united by Qin Shi Huang.
Yeah. Well,
So-
wait, what about the other guy, though? The other guy doesn't get to be
The
emperor,
other guy
too?
was like a second.
You've got Mao and you got Zhou Enlai.
Exactly.
Okay.
So Chen Sheng was declared king of the former kingdom of Chu by, I guess, the fox and his men.
Yeah.
They started a wave of peasant uprisings all over the country. And in a few months, they grew to around 10,000 men, composed mostly of discontent peasants. And 10,000 men back then is a big number.
Qin Shi Huang was not a popular emperor.
No.
Right?
Famously, no.
Famously unpopular.
Yeah. The problem of this peasant rebellion was that even though they grew very fast, this is a common theme with Chinese peasant rebellions, which is that on the battlefield, they were generally not really a match for the professional soldiers that they, waged the war against.
Yeah.
And there was also usually a lot of infighting among the rebel factions. Because if one thing about a peasant rebellion that is common, it's decentralized.
Yeah.
And it just burns through China like a wildfire. But
Yeah.
that means you have lots of different factions, lots of different groups, lots of different leaders. And they will fight amongst themselves to decide who is going to be the emperor. They can all be the emperor.
Yeah.
There can only be one China. So Wu Guang, the right-hand man, was killed as a result of this infighting
Okay.
between the rebels. And Chen Sheng was betrayed by one of his own guards and then assassinated.
Oh, okay.
So
So I guess the fox was wrong.
by recording all these manufactured signs, in a way, the historians pointed out that this was not meant to be because the signs are clearly fake.
Yeah. Well, Chinese histories and Chinese myths, they love, everybody loves this, but they love trickery, right? That's always trickery and subterfuge and little techniques and tricks. So it's interesting that, only the fake ones, they have them do tricks. But the real ones, no, those are real.
You just ignore you either don't say there was any tricks.
Yeah.
It goes back to the self-fulfilling prophecy that we kept talking about in the last episode, where if the rebellion had failed, then of course they didn't have the mandate of the heaven.
Yeah.
And of course the signs were fake.
Yeah. But if it did succeed, then either the signs are real or historians go back and make up some signs.
Maybe, right?
Yeah.
So Chen Sheng and Wu Guang died really quickly after they started the rebellion. However, they set up the example that was to be followed by the others, and the Qing dynasty ended pretty soon after.
From infighting, basically, right?
From the infighting of the court. Yeah. So that was the first peasant rebellion we're bringing to you today.
So it's interesting, though, because it's like, obviously Chinese people and Chinese kingdoms existed for thousands of years before the first dynasty. But it's like, and they had walls, right? And they had rebellions, and they had all these things.
Yeah, I'm sure.
But
that was the first.
But it doesn't count, right? I guess
No,
until
because
this
that
the first
wasn't-
dynasty.
In a way, we claim that, China has 5,000 years of history, but the Qing dynasty,
Yeah.
it was really the first one that united China. So do we really have a 5,000-year history?
Or did people just live there for?
So that was the first one.
Okay.
And the second one we are going to talk about today is White Lotus Rebellion. And White Lotus is a secret society that keeps coming up in our conversation.
Okay.
And in the first part of our top Chinese peasant rebellion episodes, we talked about how the White Lotus was an important part of the movement against the Yuan dynasty,
The Mongol dynasty.
the Mongol dynasty. I guess you could call it that.
Yeah. Kublai Khan.
The peasant rebellion they were partially responsible back then was called the Red Turban Rebellion. And the White Lotus Society was really long-lived in a way. We fast forward a few hundred years later after the Red Turban Rebellion. During the Qing dynasty, they're still making troubles.
The White Lotus. Sorry.
The White Lotus Society.
So 400 years later,
Yeah.
300 years later.
Still there. And finally, there was an official uprising against the Qing dynasty that was named after the White Lotus.
Okay.
Hence the White Lotus Rebellion. So this happened in 1796 to 1804. There's going to be a lot more records that we can find. Generally, you think they're more reliable instead of just like an urban myth.
Instead of somebody writing about something that happened 400 years earlier.
So near the end of the 17th century, there was a huge wave of migration from other areas of China to the mountainous region between Sichuan, Hubei, and Shanxi province.
Okay.
That together with the growth of local population, the area was getting crowded, work opportunities were scarce, poverty was spreading, and as always, corruption was a common scene in the local government. Finally, all things come to a head. A rebellion was started by impoverished farmers and migrant workers as, I was surprised by this, as a tax protest led by the White Lotus Society.
Okay.
Yeah. And so they had specific callings. They, of course, advocated for the restoration of the previous Ming dynasty and a better future for the followers. And this, this seems to be a thing because obviously a lot of these peasant rebellions go, oh, we want the old times to be back, make China great again. And
well, because none of them lived through it. They just assumed it was better, right?
Yeah. And if you want to have an official backing of your rebellion, what better ones than the ones that did already have the mandate of the heaven, at least once.
Yeah, and the White Lotuses, they essentially were responsible for founding the the Ming Dynasty.
The Ming Dynasty, yeah, they had a heavy hand, I think. Although, as most of these peasant rebellions, it was decentralized and guerrilla warfare was very much a theme of it. The movement spread across several provinces in China, and it was a real headache for the Qing Dynasty. At first, the Qing Dynasty didn't have a lot of local military forces in these regions, actually. The local government was also poor, hence why they were collecting high taxes.
And the Manchu, the Qing, they didn't like to have local armies and stuff, right?
Not really. And they kept their forces. Most dynasties did this, like near the capital, up north. So they had to send in the imperial forces from far away. And it was a very slow start on the government's part. So they sort of let it just happen for a little while. A few years later, the new emperor, Jiaqing Emperor, ordered a more vigorous effort to suppress the rebellion.
Okay.
Eventually, the movement was quashed. The suppression effort was quite costly for the Qing dynasty. Obviously, this happened in the midst of the Qing dynasty. It's hard to argue that it led to the end of the Qing dynasty, but the Qing dynasty had a pretty good 200 years before that. And many historians see this as sort of a turning point of Qing dynasty from its peak.
Because it went from that to like Taiping to Opium Wars. I listened to a lecture once that basically was like, you look back at the start of the Qing dynasty and they're basically Europeans are coming, and if Portuguese try anything, they get blasted. But essentially, Qing dynasty was almost like too well organized. There wasn't really anybody to fight. And for like 200 years, it was just like so peaceful and so in control that they kind of lost that ability, right?
Yeah, they've gone soft.
Yeah.
The one thing that I took from this was that the White Lotus Society, as a secret society, that actually, even though they had contributed to the founding of the Ming Dynasty, the first Ming Emperor didn't really like them all that much afterwards. And he really tried to keep his distance because he had to link himself to the Confucian scholars.
Yeah.
Right? But they still...
Ming and the White Lotus Society is what, Taoist?
It's Taoist, basically.
Okay. I think they had like free love and stuff. The White Lotus.
Oh, well, that must be frowned upon by the Confucian scholars,
Confucius
for sure.
Zero love.
Zero love.
Except
love for your father and your...
Father and son. Those are the only two real types of love. Exactly. Everything else is just
and your grandfather.
And your grandfather.
Yeah. And the emperor.
Yeah.
That's the people. There's a short list of people that you could love.
Yes.
So anyways, my point being that even though they were sort of suppressed and the emperor really didn't want to have any association with them, they still yet survived and 400 years later causing all these trouble. And so I just think there's a lot of civil organizations back then, I think, even though we just don't hear about them enough because obviously now there's a narrative of the strong central government, maybe not strong but like a stable central government, China being the stable country. Unlike Europe, divided by many smaller countries, China just sort of focused.
Well, it sort of reminds me of, it's the same thing that happened with Rome, which is you have Rome and you have such strong control and you have such safety within Rome that essentially you just push all the armies out to the provinces.
Yeah.
And And everything is so interconnected that if there's any interruption in the empire, nothing is self-sufficient anymore. Nothing can protect itself.
Yeah.
Because you have, I mean, it's like, this, if you're the city of, Phoenix, Arizona or something, right?
Yeah.
Like if there's no federal government, if there's no state government, like if you get invaded, like, you don't have an army.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that narrative, obviously it's not as simple as that.
Yeah.
If you look at the survival of the White Lotus society and the troubles they get up to.
But the other thing that's interesting, though, is that a lot of the earlier peasant rebellions, and this might just be because they're further away, so they're kind of, it's more difficult to understand what they were doing. But it's almost like they are rather faceless, right? It's like, the peasants just get mad and they just start like being bandits and burning things and forming mobs. And but this is like, they were mad about taxes.
Yeah, I know, right?
Like we know what they were upset about, right? And they have a voice that's not just like mob with the Chinese equivalent of pitchforks and torches. It kind of gives them a little bit more
agency.
I guess, agency and humanity.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the White Lotus Rebellion.
Okay, and that was crushed too.
That was crushed too.
Okay.
So
these peasant rebellions are having less success than
I know. So the third one I want to talk about is Yellow Turban Rebellion.
Okay, here we go.
So
this is probably, I'd say these days. Well, for anybody who plays video games, this is probably the most famous Chinese rebellion because.
Is it?
Well, because it's in Dynasty Warriors. It's in Three Kingdoms.
In pop culture.
Yeah, in pop culture. It's in Total War Three Kingdoms. Right? They're the kind of...
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to mention those games later.
Oh, are you? Okay.
So the Yellow Turban Rebellion, and we like to name our rebellions and wave our flags under a color. There was the Red Turban Rebellion.
We always say everything is a something turban rebellion. Well, not everything, but really, it's not like an Indian turban or a Sikh turban, right? I think it more means like almost like a scarf.
It's just a
worn
headscarf.
On the head.
Yeah.
Yeah, like a piece of cloth tied to a person's head.
And then you will have the flag that's the same color.
Yeah, flag is the same color. So don't think of it like, that they're all wearing like...
How Western-centric of that.
Turbans.
Of that disclaimer.
But,
no one was thinking that.
Just think of it like that's the type of cloth they're wearing.
Yeah. The Yellow Headscarf
Yes.
Rebellion.
Yes.
黄巾军起义. The Yellow Turban Rebellion was a peasant rebellion that happened near the end of the East Han Dynasty. It was known as the opening event of the historical novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms, like Natalie mentioned, and it was not just a fictional story. It did happen. Just a disclaimer, because it is so highly dramatized in pop culture today.
Yeah.
So it started in 184 AD, and the main movement ended within a year. I guess I'm giving it away. But, however, pockets of resistances in a guerrilla warfare style continued. Eventually, it took 21 years until the uprising was completely ended in 205 AD. Okay,
and by the end of which, that dynasty was basically
gone,
burnt out.
Ushers in the
Civil
stage
War,
of the Three Kingdoms. Yeah. What was happening around this time? You already know it. Famine, floods.
Famine, natural disaster, bandits.
Yeah, the checklist. Bring it out. So this was a time when a famine forced many farmers and former military settlers in the north to migrate down south, seeking economic opportunities.
Can I mention? So military settlers, they're a very common thing, not just in China, but in other ancient empires. And basically what you do is you have a rural area that you want to add to the empire, but no one lives there. So you just get groups of people and you say, you can live there, but you have to defend it. And if we call on you, you have to send somebody like Mulan style.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just, a Chinese style of colonization.
Yes.
And down south, where they moved to, landowners took advantage of the labor surplus and started accumulating wealth.
That's how Rome fell too, is like basically you had refugees and they just exploited them until they got fed up with it.
So there were also constant smaller floods along the lower course of the Yellow River, for as much as we call the Yellow River China's mother river. I've just read so many stories of
the Yellow River gives and it takes.
Yeah, I know, right? Furthermore, high taxes were collected to pay for military expenditures and projects such as building fortifications along the Silk Road.
Okay.
happening around this time. Internally, it wasn't going so well for the court either. This was a time of powerful eunuchs, allegedly. And let me put a disclaimer here.
Everybody blames everything on the eunuchs.
And the eunuchs, they never get names. They don't have names. You know, if there's a general who staged a coup, you know their name.
Do you know why you can always blame the eunuchs?
Yeah.
In Confucian China?
Why?
Because they don't have kids.
I know. No one's there to say.
No one's there to defend the eunuchs.
No, to defend their honors.
Kids. Yeah. So yeah,
in the eyes of the Confucian scholars and everyone else, they don't have honor already.
But anyway, eunuchs are always the villain.
Yeah. So this is why I said allegedly, because even if they're responsible, you created them. So when I say you, I mean the
yes. Not you, the listener.
Not the listener. I'm taking my anger out on for inequality out on the empress.
Yeah.
The government was widely regarded as corrupt and incapable. Against this backdrop, the famines and the floods were seen as an indication that the emperor, at this time was Emperor of Ling of Hanling Di, has lost his mandate of heaven. And it's like a episodic TV show.
Well, it is,
Every
right?
episode.
If you haven't seen it, everybody on YouTube, there's English subtitles for there's a 2010 Chinese version of Three Kingdoms. It's really good. It's like Game of Thrones.
I know. It's still the gift that keeps on giving today. So many games are made out of it. So many TV shows, movies. So against the backdrop of these events comes our hero characters, the Zhang brothers. Okay, and three of them are named Zhang Jiao, Zhang Liang, and Zhang Bao. They founded a Taoist religious movement, considered themselves followers of the way of supreme peace. And one of them, the oldest brother, I believe, were given a sacred book called The Crucial Keys to the Way of Peace. The Chinese name is 太平要术. And they were preaching the principles of equal rights of all people and equal distribution of land.
Well, that's not going to go over well.
Well, it's going to go over well with the people.
With the peasants?
Yeah, with the peasants.
Yeah.
They even had a slogan. Okay, and the Chinese is 苍天已死 皇天当立岁在甲子天下大吉. And the translation is the blue sky, or the heaven, meaning the Han dynasty, has already perished. The yellow sky, meaning the rebellion, will soon rise. In this year of Jiazi, let there be prosperity throughout the world. So, that would be a pretty popular message to the discontent peasants.
Well, and also the good thing about a rebellion like this is you throw yourself in behind a regular peasant rebellion and dynastic struggle. Like the landlords are still going to be landlords. You're not really necessarily like somebody new is going to be the emperor, but the power structure is going to stay in place.
Yeah.
But if you just overthrow the whole everything and redistribute the land, I mean that's you're better off.
They had the vision.
Yeah.
With that said, even though this was by all means a religious movement, but this was, with the undertone that there needs to be universal equality and equal rights to, I guess, land ownership in this case. And it was in a more washed down format, very acceptable to the masses. And the brothers traveled around and treated patients with faith healing. But really, it was some Chinese medicine.
Yeah.
And
which back then is just medicine.
Today we call it the Chinese medicine. And to practice the religion, you do all the regular things. You pray, you fast sometimes, you have ceremonies of music and chanting, and you burn incense. You worship a number of gods. The highest one is Taiping, Pingjun, basically Lao Tzu, an ancient Chinese philosopher, the founder of Taoism. So this was a very down-to-the-earth sort of religion.
Okay.
And the religious movement gave the brothers an opportunity to build a widespread grassroots organization, just like the churches, right? You build all these factions that are actually under your management. And in 184 AD, the brothers thought it was time to...
also, it's probably bad luck in China to kill priests.
I mean, I think it's bad luck everywhere to kill priests.
Yeah, I know. Well, but I mean, it's like, okay, if you're a rebellion, if you're a rebel, right?
Yeah.
It's like if you're a priest, you have an excuse to travel around, right? You're like, oh, I'm a traveling priest.
Yes.
That's a thing in China, right? You have
not what they thought in the Boxer Rebellion, but...
No, not in the Boxer Rebellion.
Priests were getting killed left and
Well,
right.
those are Western priests.
Uh-huh.
I mean like Taoist.
Okay.
Yeah, monks and stuff.
Yes. So in 184 AD, the brothers thought it was time to start a rebellion. They got the ball rolling by secretly coordinating with the branches of the organization at different cities, and they set a date of March 5th for everyone to break out their local rebellion and wave the flag of the red flag.
Oh, interesting.
However, just like, again, I know sound like I'm repeating myself, or this is the history. I didn't write it. Betrayal is not uncommon in these situations. Yeah. That's the repeating story. One of their followers snitched on them, and the brothers were forced to start the rebellion a month earlier. Within a month, 7 provinces, 28 counties all over China saw the breakout of the rebellion, and for a short while there, it really looked like they were unstoppable. However, the movement was quashed in 8 months. November the same year. Big thunder, tiny raindrops is what I wrote here. There were some setbacks that had led to the end of the short-lived rebellion.
Okay.
First, they did have an underprepared early start because of a snitch.
Yeah.
And especially that they couldn't take Luoyang, the capital city at the time, which was their target, on day one. So, which was the first city the government cleaned out after they got the report the rebellion was underway. They're like, kill all the priests. And they did lose some big leaders, apparently. So they couldn't take the capital like they had planned to. And the government did their job, and it was not only the official army at the time that the Yellow Turbans had to fight. Do you want to guess who they had to fight?
Warlords.
Landowners.
Landowners, okay.
There was a lot of local militias. I guess the combination of landowners who became warlords, right?
Yeah, right.
So there was a lot of local militias that were happy to take a paycheck from the government and cause these equal rights land reformers some trouble. They're trying to touch someone's cake.
Yeah.
But regardless, the army of the Han Dynasty was not as weak as the peasants probably had hoped that they would be. Even today, you might have heard of some of the names of the famous generals that led the Han army that had suppressed this rebellion. Okay. Cao Cao, the founder of one of the 3 kingdoms, was among them.
Cao Cao.
Another name, Huang Fusong. If you play the 3 kingdoms games, you would be playing them probably.
Okay.
And but even though the Yellow Turban Rebellion had ended, one of these legacies is that these famous generals that had fought them, on behalf of the Han Dynasty, grew strong. Right? And this is what you don't want. You don't want warlords to have too much power.
Yeah.
So that had, I think, more than any of the claims that were making of the other rebellions, like, oh, this had led to the end of the dynasty, right?
Yeah.
This had contributed. This had definitely contributed to the end of the Han Dynasty. Because where these people went, you see how they grew stronger and stronger.
Yeah.
And some of them have, more relationship in the court. But without this rebellion, they wouldn't have had the chance probably to grow out into these warlords. And
yeah, I mean, it's sort of I think it's Winston Churchill who said, never let a good crisis go to waste.
Yeah.
And really, it's like, even if the rebellions are ultimately unsuccessful or, they don't accomplish that much, what they do accomplish is,
stir the pot,
right? And now I'm not gathering an army to attack the capital. I'm just worried about bandits, like
I'm just here to protect the emperor.
The people, like it gives a lot of cover for people to make moves
or play politics.
Yeah.
So that was the 3 rebellions I have.
Okay, so now I finally have one. I have the greatest, perhaps the greatest, the most successful, perhaps the final peasant rebellion in Chinese history.
So far.
And that will
to date.
Yeah. And that would be Mao Zedong and the People's Liberation Army.
I wonder if that's going to be a controversial opinion that it is a peasant rebellion or not.
Yes. Yeah. Well, so we're going to get into this. So,
sure.
Okay. So Marx in the 1850s, Marx and Engels, they laid out what they viewed as communism. And in some ways, they describe it as a historical force, as, something that is happening and will happen. But
that's just where the wave of the history is going.
Yes.
Yeah.
But also they describe it, as time goes on, they do kind of advocate for it as well. They're not just passive observers. And basically, what the Communist Manifesto says, in very broad sense, is that
Have you actually read the Communist Manifesto?
I have not in many years. I read it when I was in high school as an angsty teenager. But since then, I've been on the internet, so that's basically makes me a communist, an expert on communism. But basically, it's like, okay, capital accumulates in certain groups of people. They own literally everything. Yeah. And you have people who own literally everything, and you have people who have to just the only thing they can sell is their labor.
Proletarians.
Yes, and eventually they realize, why should we be doing this?
Yeah.
And then they form a rebellion and they take over, and you get the idea. So after the initial communist Soviet revolution in Russia, agitators immediately began promoting communism abroad, both for ideological and practical reasons. So this is a similar situation to the French Revolution and also the American Revolution, which both were considered equally as radical in their day, or even the English Civil War, which is all of the countries around Russia thought, oh, we got to nip this in the bud, right? If we can't have this nation here with this radically anti-capitalist message, it's going to cause problems. And on the other hand, the new Soviet Union thought, we can't have all these capitalist nations around us.
It's a zero-sum game.
It's a zero-sum game. For our own defense, we need to promote communism.
Yeah.
Right? And because basically...
the same mentality lasted until the end of the Cold War.
Essentially, right?
Yeah.
Given its strong anti-colonial bent, communism understandably was enticing in China. So one of the things that was a problem in a place like China, or lots of colonial places, even though China wasn't strictly a colony.
Wasn't officially a colony.
But it was under the thrall of lots of foreign powers. Is that even if there were countries that were on paper anti-colonialist, like the United States, they're not going to support independence movements because it's going to piss off other colonial powers, right?
Yeah.
And this even happened during the Cold War. So, but communism has no such problem. Communism in Russia, they're happy to support any independence movements, any rebellions, because it weakens colonial powers, it weakens capitalist powers.
Yeah.
In 1918, the first communist study group was formed at Peking University and included a 24-year-old named Mao Zedong. Now, Mao Zedong essentially learned about communism, but as time went on, he would form a fundamental rift in his view of communism and the future of China than Soviet Russia, Stalin, the rest of the Communist Party in China.
Yeah. Basically
everyone but him and the people he recruited.
So it evolved with him.
But so let's talk about...
Did he attend Beijing University at the time? Or
no, I think he just went to
there
the study
for the study group.
Yeah.
Okay.
So again, Mao's life rather complicated, but Mao came from a relatively wealthy family. For peasants, they would be considered rich peasants. They had lots of other peasants working for them. They had a big farm.
Yeah.
So Mao had an education, but he got enticed by communism, and so he traveled. He had the money to travel. I think he got a job as a librarian. Anyway, but how communism is supposed to work, and I will say that Marxists have 1,000 splinter groups that all hate and sometimes murder each other. So while I'm going to give you a common... Infighting, yes. So I'm going to give you a common interpretation of how this is all supposed to work.
Okay.
And there's going to be those that disagree. So the standard communist line on how a revolution happens is this. You have a society of kings and nobles and peasants. And essentially, you have peasants that start to get rich because of proto-capitalism. And while they get money, they have no political power because all that's held by the nobles and the king. So they essentially then overthrow the nobles and form some sort of a republic or democracy or an oligarchy.
Yeah.
So that would be the United States. That would be
France.
That'd be England. That's the sort of situation that needs to happen. So broadly speaking, Marxist literature envisions two revolutions. These revolutions will more or less happen naturally and arise from pressures in society created by inequalities of wealth and power. The first is when the bourgeoisie, in this context, merchants, factory owners, rich commoners, overthrow a system of noble privilege. This ushers in capitalism, and eventually so much wealth accumulates in the hands of capitalists that you have an entire class of people who do not work and subsist off of owning the means of production, much as nobles lived off the labor of the peasants that tilled their lands in earlier times. Now, the reason you need this first revolution to happen is because, in Marx's view, workers are going to be professional, educated people with the ability to form a complex society. They will understand how they're being exploited and how to form a better society. And in Marx's view, peasants essentially aren't there. I mean, farmers, day laborers, they might not be literate. You know, they don't have a class bond.
They can't form unions.
They're tied to the land. And this is sort of a class, because Marx is middle class, right? He's basically bourgeoisie, right? They're not poor people. So I think that is a bit of snobbery, that peasants are essentially incapable of this sort of revolution.
To participate or start a revolution.
Yes. So the problem with China and Russia, but that's a whole different topic, is that it never had the first revolution. There were no masses of workers who could read and write and understand technology. The literacy rate in 1920 was perhaps 25 to 30%.
In China.
While China had been through several revolutions, the vast majority of people were rural, unmechanized farmers. These farmers worked in villages that were not far removed, if removed at all, from villages 1,000 years ago. In a classical Marxist theory, these peasants would not be able to fully understand communism or self-organize into a dictatorship of the proletariat.
Okay.
So Mao thought, though, this is a positive.
Mao thought... How is it a positive?
Well, probably because he's a peasant. But Mao thought, this is great, because these peasants don't know anything.
Okay.
They don't know anything bad, so they're a blank slate.
He can educate them.
We're going to educate them.
In his way.
Okay. They're not corrupted by materialism. They're tough.
Yet.
They're not corrupted by materialism. They're tough. I don't have any ideological competition, and they're angry, and there's a lot of them.
Okay, so he saw an opportunity, really.
He saw an opportunity. And in retrospect, it's kind of obvious, okay? So...
I know, but that's the mandate of the heaven.
Oh, yeah, but...
Now you say it's obvious.
We'll talk about it, right? So, so he thought we can start from scratch with the peasants. China needs communism now. If all China has was peasants, we're going to have a peasant revolution. Not a rebellion, Cherry, but a revolution. So Mao wasn't the only communist in China, though.
No.
He was one of a bunch.
He's the later comers, too. He wasn't
And he wasn't the only nationalist. Almost everybody was involved with communism in some way, because the governments in China at that point would take help from anybody who would give it to them.
Including Soviet Russia
and America and whoever else. Nazi Germany, right?
Very contradicting bad buddies.
Yes. So Sun Yat-sen, the original overthrower of the Qing dynasty, stabbed in the back by Ren Shikai, he would take help from anyone he could get. And he was involved with Soviet advisors and the nascent CCP, what would become the Communist Party of China. In the early 20s, they had an alliance against their mutual enemies, landowners, warlords, and imperial powers. However, his death... And just as a side note, so Sun Yat-sen not remembered now as like an ardent communist, but his ideas were fairly big. He was huge on land reform and all this other stuff. But anyway, his death in 1925 would lead to a split between rival visions of China's future. On one side was his right-wing militaristic successor, Chiang Kai-Shek, and the other was the CCP, the Communist Party of China.
And really, Mao wasn't really all that much at the center of power at all at this point.
He was just a dude.
Yeah.
So while some members of the CCP, wished to focus on the workers of large cities like Shanghai, Mao was only focused on the peasantry. The KMT was too well connected with criminal organizations in the city. And he found the workers there to be too corrupt and too lacking the requisite revolutionary passions. So
they've been spoiled.
Yeah, they've been spoiled, right? And this is a thing that you'll see, especially early on, is that the communists would try and organize labor unions. They do all these things in these cities.
People weren't that motivated.
people weren't that
Right.
motivated, so sure, you can organize the labor unions, but Chiang Kai-Shek would just get in with the gangs. Because
He did, yeah.
Yeah, because these port cities, these industrial cities had huge criminal enterprises, and they all had guns. I mean, they're basically almost like bandit armies. So he would just get them to crush them. Because technically they were originally on the same side, and then he sort of betrayed them. His disregard for the party line eventually led him being expelled, but he simply ignored them and formed his own microstate, perfecting his
That's a history we do not talk about today.
Yes.
Yeah.
Perfecting his technique of essentially murdering landlords and redistributing the land. The interesting thing is like, so what Mao did, obviously the peasants are there, so that's easier. But it's kind of harder in a way, because if you're the CCP, you can negotiate with a labor union, right? It's already a structure that's there, right? That you can try and get on your side. But Mao would start from scratch, right? He formed his own governments, he formed his own armies.
Yeah.
He
was a real grassroots.
He was real grassroots, but he
Yeah.
had the advantage of you could just take a landlord and shoot them, and then redistribute the land, and people like that.
Yeah.
So this technique was the power and weakness of Mao. He had no allies, no one to whom he was beholden. Chiang Kai-shek often needed to appease others, from warlords to foreign powers to feudal landlords. Like a Chinese emperor of old, he relied on existing power structures to function.
Yeah.
Whereas Mao just ripped them up and left new ones in their wake. And, it didn't go very well for a long time. So this is the famous quote by Mao, and I love it. I love this quote by Mao. I don't love Mao. Obviously, he's a bad person, but I love this quote by Mao. So he said, "Revolution is not a dinner party, nor an essay, nor a painting, nor a piece of embroidery.
Yeah.
It cannot be so refined, so leisurely and gentle, so temperate, kind, courteous, restrained, and magnanimous. A revolution is an insurrection, an act of violence by which one class overthrows another."
Yeah.
So Mao would, tell somebody like Bernie Sanders, like he's an idiot. He's like, are we doing communism here or are we not? Right? Like,
Yeah.
Either we're,
Everyone in America who complains that Bernie Sanders is just too crazy.
yeah. No, Mao's like, let's own what we're doing.
Yeah.
We're going to kill an entire class of people, essentially.
Yeah, that's how we don't need to convert them. We don't need to convince them.
We're not going to talk it over. There's no negotiation.
We're not going to outvote them.
No.
We're just going to kill them.
We're just going to, or imprison them, take, what I mean? But we're just going to do it because we're stronger.
Yeah.
There's no negotiation. There's no trickery. There's no sneakery. We're just going to get it done.
There's no concept of, ownership of property. Yeah.
So Mao continued to fight with the Soviet-influenced Central Party Committee throughout the early 1930s.
Yeah.
Who continued to disagree with his ideas on revolution. Eventually, Mao took full control during the Long March, a period where communist forces broke out of KMT encirclement and traveled to a mountainous region of northern China. Out of perhaps 80,000 that set out, less than 8,000 remained after the journey of a year.
Yeah.
But they were incontestably Mao's 8,000.
I know. It's crazy. That's a 90%
loss rate.
Casualty rate.
No, but Cherry, you're forging a sword, you got to beat out the impurities.
It's one of the must-learn lessons of how the Long March,
yes,
was the testament to the spirit of the Chinese country and the people.
Yes. Well, and I think it's interesting because obviously, so they set out all the basically, so Chiang Kai-shek was like, we got to get rid of these communists. So, and this was the whole thing. The Japanese were biting off pieces of territory and he just ignored them because he was focused on the communists. And yeah, so all the communists had to escape north or get killed on this long march. You're left with 8,000 people, more or less, that you can trust implicitly, because otherwise they wouldn't have done it, right? I mean, it was like a year. People could have just snuck off at any time.
Yeah.
So, you have forged this kind of implement, and then you can go and, send those people out. So from then on, Mao's view of peasant revolution was the dominant one, and his techniques of people's war and violent land reform would continue to rot away the power of the KMT from within.
Yeah.
Perhaps his greatest coup was getting Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalists to begin open warfare with the Japanese. By 1945, Mao basically did some shenanigans and essentially by hook or by crook,
Okay.
put Chiang Kai-Shek on the spot
Yeah.
to fight the Japanese. And like,
Yeah.
oh, we'll fight them together. But by 1945, KMT forces had fought almost a decade of grueling battle against the Imperial Japanese Army, with the CCP stronger than ever. The People's Army stronger than ever. Unable to get foreign troops to assist, Chiang Kai-Shek found himself the master of China's rich, burgeoning industrial cities, while Mao controlled the countryside. However, in the end, the peasants won, and in 1949, the new China was declared. So now, while Mao's army was certainly peasants, what of Mao himself? While his father started off extremely poor, years of frugal living and good business decisions meant that Mao was born into a family that was relatively wealthy by rural standards. Thus, it is a strange irony that had the Red Army come across young Mao's family, he would likely have been re-educated or killed as the son of a landlord.
Yeah.
So,
Well, okay, no. The son of the landlord would wage the war against his own father.
yeah, until the
and
Cultural
kill his
Revolution.
father. Kill the Cultural Revolution. And then it became like, it wasn't enough that you had killed your father.
No,
It's in your blood.
it's in your blood.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so the strange irony of the whole situation of communism, this is just a side note, that communism is really supposed to happen in powerful, industrial, modern nations.
Or at least that was the theory.
Yes, right? So they thought like, oh, it's going to happen in England, it's going to happen in France, it's going to happen in Germany, it's going to happen in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
But it's only really happened in societies with huge peasant populations and, that aren't industrialized. I mean, China is the biggest example of that, right? And they tried it with the workers and it didn't work because there's not that many of them.
Yeah, and I mean, Mao's this strategy of, trying it with the peasants, build a real grassroots movement from the countryside, wasn't a popular one to begin with, like you said.
Yeah.
Right? And he really had to sort of prove himself in a way.
Well, and if you think about it, right, so obviously Mao is rich by peasant standards, his family, but he was still a peasant.
Yeah.
And the vast majority of people studying in these communist study groups, going to these classes, they're not peasants.
Mao doesn't speak another language, never went to France like Zhou Enlai did.
Yeah, right.
Or Japan like Sun Yat-sen did. And the people in the Communist Party, from what we can read today, is that they were sort of snooty against him, right?
Oh, yeah.
But through a lot of power struggles, I would say,
Yeah.
Mao came to power with perhaps too much help from Zhou Enlai. But also it's through this peasant army he's built for himself.
And I think to a certain extent, right, I think Mao was completely right in one extent, which is like there's this concept of that the peasants won't be able to understand, or they won't care about the revolutionary doctrine and the communism, that they're just going to look out like, oh, we're going to get some land, we're just in it for ourselves, right? But I think they really seem to understand it. Like if you look at the Red Army, they really seem to believe it. And I think ironically, you get to the Cultural Revolution and you get people who've grown up in it.
Yeah.
And they have a much more, I don't know, they don't have as quite a magnanimous view as the original kind of peasants Mao recruited.
The people in the Cultural Revolution? The
Red
Guards?
Well, I'm just thinking about, like you think like, because American POWs really had nice things to say about the Chinese in POW camps and stuff, right?
But they were perhaps extra nice to them.
I know.
As for propaganda reasons.
Because they really thought like we got to spread the revolution.
Oh yeah, you're saying, okay, I get what you're saying now.
Yeah, that they're true believers.
Like they were, yeah. Oh no, of course, yeah.
Yeah.
And some of these people after 1949 decided that it's time to build the country. Not all of them were. Like the revolution, the fire of the revolution is gonna keep burning until the end of the time, like Mao was. And so not everyone who had this vision necessarily had the same exact vision like Mao.
No,
but the part where
you can teach peasants to be political. Yeah,
and he did.
And obviously that had some bad ramifications in certain things, but I think it is interesting, right? Mao is, out of any of the people we've probably talked about in any of the peasant revolutions, Mao is probably the best at revolutioning out of any of them as a skill set, right? Like if you dropped Mao down in the Yellow Turban Rebellion, they probably would have won. right? Like he's good at it.
Yeah, well, didn't we were talking about how you were saying, if he was like in jail or something, and he would probably talk the guards
into letting him
out, and the guard would join the revolution.
Yes.
And there are just some people who are just, that's what they do, right?
Yeah.
And obviously one of the problem then is that that's all they want to do.
Yes.
Like all the time, forever. And then
until it's time to figure out like how
do we build a country?
How do we build railroads and plant crops?
And people around him, those people who might have gone through the revolutionary times with him, they did this because they want an opportunity to build a country.
Yes.
Which they set out to do afterwards, and only Mao was like, no. No. We're the revolution, a permanent revolution is not over.
Yes.
And
is America communist? Is Japan?
Yeah,
like, no, we're not done. Yeah, we're not done here.
We need to recruit more people to my communism school so they can be sent home to
more babies, more soldiers
to start. Yeah, exactly. So,
but anyway, that is and that's an argument also for why the communist revolution is a peasant revolution instead of a workers' revolution. And that's really kind of one of the main differences between when people say Maoism versus communism. Why it has its own...
It's not exactly the same.
It's not exactly the same, no. Well, that was 4 more revolutions.
So that's our top 10.
That's
top 8.
Top 8.
I cannot count.
Yeah.
Top 8 selections of Chinese peasant rebellions. There's a lot more smaller ones that are interesting.
Yeah, we might do some supplemental ones.
Sure, yeah.
We could do top 4 Taoist rebellions.
Or just do an episode on Taoism.
Or do an episode on Taoism.
I'm curious. Yeah. We're all students of history here.
Yes. Hopefully you enjoyed that, and we'll be back soon with more episodes. We have some episodes on some modern topics coming up. We try and have a mix.
If there's any topics you would like to request, you can go on our website and email
go on our
us.
Website. Well, you could email us. I was going to say we don't have like comments on our website.
You go on our website to email us.
Or
you could leave us a review on Apple Podcast or wherever you're listening to your podcast at. If they let you do a review, it will be great to hear from you.
Unless you don't like it, then don't review it.
No, we want constructive criticism.
If you don't like it, tell us on Twitter. But leave a 5-star review.
Okay. All right. Well, with that said, thank you for listening today, and we will see you next time.
All right. Have a nice day.